Hello! So we are going to read a book this morning. As you can see, the dogs are watching as well. They're listening. They're nice and happy outside, aren't they? So we are going to read The Swan Princess. Far away and long ago, there lived a little girl named Eliza, who was the king's only daughter. The queen had died when Eliza was born, but she had a kind father and 11 older brothers to look after her. When her brothers went to school, Eliza looked at beautiful picture books or watched swallows swoop past. She couldn't have been happier. Then, one bitterly cold winter, the king married again. His new wife was tall and elegant, and everyone admired her, but she had a dark secret. The new queen was a witch. The queen hated the king's children, and she vowed to get rid of them. She spent her days alone inside the palace, stroking her warty pet toads and dreaming up spiteful spells. A week later, the princes came home from school to find the queen barring their way. "You're not wanted here," she shouted. "Fly away like wild birds." The horrified princes began to spout white feathers. One by one, they turned into swans and flew out to sea. The queen went inside and told the king the princes had run away. Now, there was just Eliza. The queen didn't dare cast another spell in case the kings grew suspicious. But as the years passed, Eliza grew so beautiful that the queen couldn't bear her jealousy no longer. One night she secretly dropped her toads into Eliza's bath and whispered some magic words. "These 3 toads will make Eliza ugly, stupid and wicked." Eliza was too good to be enchanted by such an evil spell. When she stepped into the bath, the toads turned into flowers. Their red petals floated gently on the water. The queen was furious. She needed a new plan. When Eliza finished her bath, the queen made her sit down, away from the mirror. She then wiped Eliza's face with walnut juice and tangled her hair while pretending to comb it. Now Eliza looked nothing like her beautiful self. Her father didn't even recognize her. "Who let this wild creature in?" he shouted. "Take it away." The guards tried to seize her. Eliza slipped between them and ran out of the castle, sobbing. She fled to the forest to hide. Eliza wandered through the forest until she came to a lake. She knelt down and washed her face with the cool, refreshing water. Look how beautiful that is. As the sun set, Eliza looked around to see where she might spend the night. Something in the distance caught her eye. A group of swans was flying over the trees. They shook their wings, and to Eliza's astonishment, instead of swans, her brothers stood before her. Eliza was overjoyed. When they had all finished hugging, Prince Julian told her what had happened. "The queen's spell turned us into swans," he explained, "but we become human again at night. Tomorrow we must fly back to our new home." "I'm coming with you," Eliza said. Eliza and her brothers spent all night weaving a net of rushes so the swans would be able to carry her. As the sun rose, the swans lifted Eliza into the air and they flew far over the sea. As dusk fell, they landed. Once again, the swans shed their feathers. "This is now our home," Julian told Eliza, showing her a cave carpeted with soft green moss. That night, Eliza dreamed she was still flying through the clouds. In the dream, a beautiful fairy appeared before her. "Eliza," she said, "you can save your brothers from the queen's spell. You must make each one a shirt of nettles. When they put on the shirts, the spell will be broken. But you must make the shirts in silence," the fairy warned. "If you speak a word before the spell is ended, your brothers will die." Eliza reached out to touch a nettle. It stung her fingers and she woke up. The next day, Eliza set to work. She picked huge armfuls of nettles and started to weave them together. They stung her hands, but she didn't make a sound. By evening, her fingers were covered in blisters, but Eliza didn't mind. She had almost finished the first shirt. When the princes saw her weaving, they knew what Eliza was trying to do. They thanked her, but she could not reply. Prince Jasper wept to see her fingers. Where his tears touched her skin, it healed at once. The next day, Eliza set off to pick some more nettles and stopped in an overgrown churchyard. "What is your name?" called a voice from behind her. Eliza spun around to see a handsome king watching her. "What are you doing in my grounds?" the king asked her, "and why are you picking nettles?" But Eliza could not reply. She can't talk, the king realised. "Come back to my palace," he said gently, "and I'll look after you." Eliza shook her head, but it was no good. The king led her through his gardens and into the vast palace. Before long, the king was in love with the strange, silent girl. When she spent all day weaving nettles, he gave her soft gloves to cover her blistered fingers, and his kindness made Eliza love him in return. Soon the king had made up his mind. "Will you marry me?" he asked Eliza. She smiled and nodded. The king summoned his archbishop. "I'm getting married," he told him. The archbishop threw up his hands in horror. He thought Eliza was a witch. "You hardly know the girl," he cried. "I don't care," said the king. "I'll marry her anyway." Meanwhile, Eliza wove busily. By the night before the wedding, she had made 10 shirts. "I'll finish the last one tonight," she thought happily. As she started the final shirt, she realised she needed more nettles. "I'll just have to go and pick some," she decided. Outside, it was so dark she could barely see the graveyard. She shivered. "There's no such thing as ghouls or ghosts," she told herself bravely. The archbishop was awake, worrying about the wedding. He saw Eliza slip out and decided to follow her. Only a witch would pick nettles at midnight, he told himself. When Eliza began wandering among the tombstones, he decided he had seen enough. "Stop, witch," he cried. His shout brought the palace guards running. On his orders, they seized Eliza and threw her into prison. The next day, instead of a wedding, there was a trial. Eliza was brought before the judge in chains. "I saw her picking nettles in the graveyard at midnight," the archbishop cried. "She must be a witch." "Well, what do you say to that?" the judge asked Eliza, but she could not speak to defend herself. The judge frowned. "The girl is a witch. She will be executed tomorrow." The king was heartbroken, but there was nothing he could do. Eliza was thrown into a tiny prison cell, and her shirts were thrown in after her. "I nearly finished them," she thought desperately, "but now I'll never see my brothers again." She felt completely miserable. Suddenly, something fluttered against the window. Eliza looked up and saw Jasper looking back at her. She held up the shirts so Jasper could see them. He bowed his head and then flew away. "I mustn't give up," Eliza told herself. She spent all night weaving the final shirt. At dawn, there was just one sleeve left to make, and then she ran out of nettles. Minutes later, there was a bang on the door. The guards had come to take her away. They led her outside, still clutching the shirts. A huge crowd had gathered to see the execution. Before it could start, there was a startled murmur, and people began pointing at the sky. 11 white swans were flying closer and closer. The swans swooped down one by one. They swept past Eliza so she could throw the shirts over them. The crowd gasped. There was a shimmering in the air, and then instead of the swans, 11 young men stood beside Eliza. At the same time, Eliza's chains turned into white roses and fell to the ground. The spell was finally broken and Eliza could speak. "Oh, Jasper," cried Eliza, "you've still got a swan's wing." "I don't mind," he replied, giving her a big feathery hug. Then the king spoke. "I don't know what's going on here," he said, "but perhaps you can tell me at the wedding feast, if you still want to marry me," he continued, turning shyly to Eliza. "Oh yes," said Eliza, smiling, and there won't be any witches at this wedding, I promise." The end. I hope you all enjoyed that. Dee and Lola,